So welcome again, everybody, to the second of my programs. This one is an introduction to the Gospels. And here's the outline of what I would like to do. I want to look, first of all, very briefly, just at the word gospel itself, the four Gospels, and then a quick look each at Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John, then some questions for reflection, and as before, a reading plan. Our English word gospel means good news. It comes from Old English, God meaning good, and spell meaning news, which we still have when we talk about somebody giving a spiel about something. So God's spell then became gospel. And that means good news, and it's a perfectly clear translation of the Greek, euangelion, which simply means good news. And while we think of the word gospel as a holy word, in fact, gospel was used by the Roman authorities to speak about the good news about the Emperor Augustus, for example. But it also turns up in the Old Testament in Greek, meaning good news from God. So there are two layers of meaning. Not only that, in our tradition, the word gospel means actually three things. First of all, it is the proclamation of Jesus, what Jesus said, his own message, the gospel from God. At the second moment, it's Paul's proclamation about Jesus, because he talks about gospel, but he tells us actually very little about Jesus' own message. Instead, he has a proclamation about Jesus' death and resurrection, which he calls the gospel. And finally, then we have what we call the four Gospels, the books. So the word gospel then has three layers of meaning: what Jesus said, what Paul said about Jesus, and then the four Gospels, the four books that have come down to us. So four Gospels have come down to us: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. These are conventional titles. It's not really known who wrote each one, and the earliest texts are anonymous. Each one presents itself as a kind of biography of the period, and people at the time did write biographies, bios, but the Gospels are a bit like that, but of a kind of special kind. They were written not to report the past precisely, but actually to proclaim Jesus risen from the dead by telling his story and his message, his preaching and his miracles. Each of the Gospels has a similar shape, but then each one then goes its own way. At the core you have the ministry of Jesus, so time in Galilee, the passion and resurrection, so time in Jerusalem, a prologue to begin and an epilogue to end. We can see this very simply in Mark's Gospel. So here's a timeline of the Gospel that can be helpful. I think Mark was written about the year 70 AD, very close to the time of the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD, and his Gospel reflects that trauma. Matthew is written somewhat later, 15 to 20 years later. It represents the time when Christians were beginning to break away from the mother religion, and simply the pain of that separation is registered in Matthew's Gospel. John's Gospel is written about 95 AD, so a little bit later, a complex document written and then edited and edited again over a long period. So what we have is a fruit of a long evolution. And finally, while many people think that Luke's Gospel was written about the time Matthew's Gospel was written, so 85 to 90 AD, I personally side with those scholars who think it's quite later, like 110 or 115. And I think it reflects the beginnings of Christian anti-Judaism. And Luke is at pains to say that the roots of Christianity are firmly within Judaism. And so that comes through in his Gospel and also in the Acts of the Apostles. His writing is very important. It makes up 27% of the New Testament, the Gospel and the Acts. And so if we didn't have Luke, we'd be missing more or less a quarter of the earliest Christian tradition. This gives us an idea of the emerging of early Christianity. It's a map where people have been able to track Christian presence about the year 100, so around the time of the writings of our texts. I emphasize one area because people have generally forgotten it, that is Syria. And Paul was active in Syria, so was Peter in Antioch. I think Mark was written in Syria. I think Matthew was also written in Syria. I think John's Gospel began to be written in Syria and when was completed in Western Turkey, Asia Minor. And one of the earliest and most important Christian writers is Ignatius of Antioch in Syria. So while we haven't retained the memory of Syria, in fact, Syria was very important for the early Christian movement. So we take a look at each of the Gospels. So Mark is the first Gospel to be written. He's the one who invents this particular style where he uses a narrative to proclaim the good news about Jesus. It's the shortest of the Gospels. I noticed there are 16 chapters, roughly 11,000 words. It's written for a community undergoing a tremendous upheaval, the Jewish War, which is a huge cataclysmic event for Jews and Christians in the first century. It was written for a mixed community of both Jews and Gentiles. And one of the questions is, how can we respond to these events? Traditionally, people have said Mark was written in Rome, but I personally side with those scholars who think that it was written actually in Syria, so close to the events that have affected the telling. The shape of the gospel is very simple. It is very likely that Jesus' ministry was 3 years, but Mark insists on a 1-year ministry, probably for teaching clarity. And so at the center of his gospel, you have the Galilean ministry and then the Judean ministry, so chapters 1 to 9 and 10 to 15, preceded by a prologue, an introduction, 1 to 14, and concluded by an epilogue, 16, 1 to 8. And just to notice, it is very likely that the original Mark's Gospel ended at 16:8. Later editions have added a variety of endings, but none of these is original. Generations were not happy with the original enigmatic ending, which ended with the words, "They said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid." I think Mark's Gospel was written in response to issues, challenges, what I'm calling here questions. So here's a list which is not unlike the kind of list we need to ask ourselves today. So he's talking about faith. What do we believe about Jesus? And he has a particular teaching in the gospel. Action. How should we conduct ourselves as followers of Jesus? And there's a tremendous teaching on discipleship in the center of the gospel. Identity. Who are we as disciples? And the real question there is, Jews and Gentiles, how do we live together in the one community? How may the community best serve the gospel message? So how do we proclaim the word? And finally, what are we proclaiming and how are we doing it? So those 5 questions, faith, action, identity, community, and message, were the guiding challenges or questions for the production of Mark's gospel and can help us today as well as we reflect on how we proclaim and live the gospel in our time. We now move to the Gospel according to Matthew. Now, it's commonly agreed that Matthew is a second expanded edition of Mark. It's a long Gospel, 28 chapters, roughly 18,000 words. And this time written very explicitly for a mixed community made up of Jews and Gentiles, all believing in Christ, but all experiencing the painful break from the mother religion. And technically, Matthew's community is a sect. That's to say, a breakaway group which is a bit antagonistic towards the mother religion, but also feels it's fulfilling what the mother religion is failing to achieve. So it's an interesting relationship. Composed after the Jewish War, so 85 to 90, when not only Christians but also Jews were reorganizing themselves and trying to imagine how they should be in a period with no temple and no priesthood. Written most likely in Antioch in Syria, at that time the 3rd largest city of the Roman Empire with a very large Jewish community. The shape of the Gospel resembles that of Mark. At the center, the Galilean ministry, 3 to 18, the Judean ministry, 19 to 27, and then a prologue, chapters 1 to 2, and an epilogue, chapter 28. The prologue is very different. It tells the birth stories of Jesus, the Annunciation to Joseph, the wise men, and so on. It's really quite different. But Matthew does accept Mark's reduction of the time of Jesus to a 1-year ministry, but expands it then with a great deal of teaching on discipleship in the course of his gospel layout. What questions lie behind Matthew's gospel? I would say something like this. There's a question of continuity. What is our relationship with the mother religion, Judaism? That's a big question for Matthew's gospel. faith. How does Jesus relate to Moses? And that's because this community is a breakaway community from Judaism. The figure of Moses remains important. Then how does Jesus relate to Moses? The practice of the law. What does keeping the law now mean in the light of Jesus' ministry and then also his death and resurrection? And with that comes an important question. Who interprets the Torah, the law, for us? And in Matthew's Gospel, it turns out to be Peter is an important interpreter. And finally, what is now our missionary task? At the very end of the Gospel, there's a tremendous scene. Go forth and baptize all nations in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit. So a very strong outward reach in Matthew's Gospel. When we come to Luke, we have a further expanded edition of Mark. This is actually the longest Gospel, only 24 chapters, but actually 19,000 words. Chiefly for a Gentile church. So the Jewish presence has gone down over the generations. Written at a time when some were questioning the Jewish roots of the Christian faith. This became much more explicit later in the 2nd century when some people began to reject the entire Old Testament and the figure of God in the Old Testament. Many scholars think Luke was written about 85 or 90, but I find myself in agreement with those who think it's later, 110 or 115. The location of writing is probably Rome. As for the shape of the Gospel, it's a little different. As you can see from the picture here, there is a Galilean ministry. There's also a Judean ministry. But in the center, there's a very long section when Jesus makes a journey from Galilee to Jerusalem, chapters 9 to 19. And in there, Luke puts an immense amount of teaching on discipleship and many of his most famous and richest parables. He precedes it with a prologue and concludes with an epilogue. The prologue resembles the prologue of Matthew, its birth stories, but an entirely different set of birth stories. What kind of questions is a gospel like Luke asking? Well, I think the following observations may help. The writer does want to affirm the Christian roots are firmly in Judaism. At the same time, Jesus is the fulfillment of ancient promises and hopes found in the Old Testament. The picture he gives of Jesus is a picture of a prophet, a witness. Now, the Greek for witness is martyr, so someone who bears witness, and also the Son of God. And at the beginning of his Gospel, Luke has a scene of Jesus preaching in Nazareth when he quotes the prophet Isaiah, and he puts the entire ministry of Jesus under the banner of the year of the Lord's favor, the Jubilee year, a year of celebration, a year of restoration, and a year of liberation. And these are the marks of Luke's presentation of Jesus. He's also concerned about expansion. How do we bring the good news beyond ethnic Judaism? He prefigures this in the Gospel, but then actually narrates the story in the Acts of the Apostles. So we have 3 Gospels that resemble each other. Mark, the first Gospel, using sources that were available. Matthew and Luke, both are based on Mark, using him as a source. Matthew and Luke also use a collection of sayings, some 235 verses or so, called Q in scholarship, from the German word for a source. And then each of the Gospels has material peculiar to it, often marked in studies as M for Matthew and L for Luke. For example, the wise men in the birth stories are found only in Matthew, so that's M, or the prodigal son, a famous parable, is found only in Luke, so that's kind of L. And on the right-hand side, a very simple representation of the sources for Matthew and Luke. They both use Mark and Q, the saying source, and then they have other material as well. On the next slide, I have a more complex map, and you may like to pause the video to meditate on this. Here it is. So here's a more complex map of the relationship between these first 3 Gospels. They are called the Synoptic Gospels, from a Greek word meaning looking at things together. And it's true, you can line up the Gospels and they tell more or less the same story, but there are considerable differences and overlaps. And you may like to pause the video here, just contemplate this more complex vision of how the first 3 Gospels actually relate. Then we come to the Gospel according to John. This is a very different text and a very different gospel. And in this gospel, the ministry of Jesus actually lasts 3 years, which is most likely historical. It's a longish gospel, so 21 chapters with some 15,000 words. It seems to have been written for a very mixed community, made up of ex-followers of John the Baptist, ex-Pharisees, ex-Samaritans, and ex-Gentiles, non-Jews. In the course of the gospel, there are very deep reflections in the light of the Old Testament, in the light of the figure of wisdom from the Old Testament, according to the Jewish feasts and the liturgies, and also John's gospel reflects on the Synoptic tradition. The writing of this gospel most likely started in Syria, and the text was edited over a long time and eventually finalized most probably in Ephesus in Asia Minor in Western Turkey today. To get a map of this gospel, it's very different to the other gospels. At the center you see chapters 1 to 12, the book of signs, various events and teachings. And then you have the book of glory. And the book of signs is chiefly in Galilee, but there are journeys up and down to Jerusalem. And the book of glory is all in Jerusalem. And there is an epilogue, chapter 21, and a very profound prologue. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, and so on for 18 verses, a kind of key to the proclamation of this particular gospel. What questions is the fourth gospel asking? Well, for this, I've actually taken questions from the gospel itself, from different stories. So here are some questions that could also count for today. What are you looking for? Or in a more literal translation, what do you desire? How can one be born again? What must we do to do the works of God? And who is he, the blind man is speaking, that I may believe in him? And then marvelously, Pilate to Jesus, where are you from? And then Jesus to Mary Magdalene, whom are you looking for? And so I've mapped those under the heading, journey, encounter, discipleship, the Christ, Jesus, and then back to journey again. So this gospel has a very particular focus on the person of Jesus risen from the dead, and this is reflected in the questions which come up here, as you can see. So we have 4 gospels, effectively 4 lenses, 4 different ways of looking at the same story, all written at least 40 years after Jesus' death and resurrection. Written also when the first generation of witnesses, the apostles and Paul, had all died. And while they are also biographies, they're written in the light of Jesus' resurrection. And they have a purpose. And the purpose is to confirm, to enlighten, and to strengthen faith. None is strictly historical. As we saw, Mark and Matthew and Luke reduced the ministry of Jesus to 1 year. But they all contain some history, of course. So the best way to look at them is 4 lenses, 4 perspectives, 4 prisms refracting the light of faith then and now. So after that quick run over the 4 Gospels, I'm going to leave you with similar questions. One thing I learned is, wherever that might have been, I was touched by something that maybe moved you. One thing that surprises me is, there can still be surprises in biblical studies, and then perhaps I'd like to know more about something. And at the end, my own takeaway from all of this is as follows. And like in the previous presentation, I'm going to leave you with a reading plan of a sort, in kind of 22 sittings if you were to follow it. But really following the shape of each gospel. So here's a reading plan for Mark. The prologue, very short. The Galilean ministry, which needn't be read in one sitting. The Judean ministry, and then the epilogue. It's a possible way of reading, being aware of the way Mark presents the content. Matthew is quite similar, except he orders his material in the center into 5 large books which have narrative and sermon combined. And it would be good to separate those. And here you have the division. The prologue, the beginnings, book 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, then the passion story and the epilogue. And it's good to read section by section in Matthew, as he intends us to do. Luke is, as we saw, somewhat different. He has the Galilean ministry, the Judean ministry, and in the middle a long section on discipleship when Jesus is literally walking the way to Jerusalem with a prologue and an epilogue to end. And you could use those divisions for your own reading. More simply then, in the Gospel of John, you have a prologue, very profound, and it's good to read it at the end of reading the whole Gospel and just see how rich the opening words are. The Book of Signs, chapter 1 to chapter 12, could be read in a number of sessions. The Book of Glory, that contains the washing of the feet, the farewell discourse, and then the trial and death of Jesus. And finally then, the stories of the resurrection in the epilogue. That's a possible reading plan for familiarizing yourself with the whole Gospel. We hear these texts in bits and pieces at public worship, and it's a very good idea to get a sense of how the whole thing stands in each book by reading each book separately. Thank you very much, everybody, for taking part in this program.